Now let's revisit and put some more detail and nuance into the difference between liberals and conservatives. Going back over here to conservative or the conservative aspect of the political spectrum. So again, if someone is conservative, it means that they're very cautious. They believe in slow change, if at all, but they believe in a very limited role of government. But there are different types of conservatives and conservatism. And the three I have up here are not all of them, but they're the predominant terms that you hear in the political discourse in the United States through the media and so forth. So some conservatives, and you can be more than one. It's not they're not mutually exclusive. Some conservatives are social conservatives that we have right here, and social conservatives have a certain agenda of social issues, social as they define, social moral issues. A social conservative largely is someone who is against same-sex marriage. They're not for abortion rights and so forth. They're against public schools having sexual education classes that possibly distribute condoms and so forth to prevent the spread of AIDS or HIV. Just as examples, many, if not the bulk, of social conservatives are driven by a Christian religious right affiliation. For example, President George W. Bush was a social conservative in many ways. We have fiscal conservatives, and fiscal conservatives are worried about the management of budget and finance throughout the economy, and especially the United States and state governments. So a fiscal conservative is someone who believes that the government really shouldn't be going beyond its means financially in order to achieve its goals. Now, it doesn't mean if you're a fiscal conservative that you're not willing to go into debt, because in reality, for example, many conservative business leaders began by taking out loans from banks and borrowing money. It's that, are you borrowing money in a rational way that allows you to pay it back and is not putting you so in debt that you'll never be able to get out of debt and be productive economically or otherwise socially. And so that same mentality is applied to the government's finances and government policies. So fiscal conservatives, they might not, they certainly are not against borrowing money, but they very much are against having and carrying so much debt that it makes it difficult for the government to have full capacity to spend its resources and its time financially in a manner that does not limit them and put them in poor standing with credit rating agencies and so forth. So fiscal conservatives are very, very cautious about going into debt. Now, again, that's one perspective. There are competing perspectives about borrowing money, and we'll get to that when we get to the left part of the spectrum. Neoconservatives, neo meaning new over here, are conservatives, meaning a new type of conservative, and that term has been around for a couple of decades. Neoconservatives are conservatives that essentially largely believe in classical liberalism. They believe in liberal democracy, but they're very much connected to the expansion of American power and having the United States be the primary advocate for those beliefs, and believe in spreading those beliefs throughout the globe. So, for example, we know that President Bush and many of his advisors, George W. Bush, were considered neoconservatives. Neoconservatives are not necessarily fiscal conservatives because, for example, George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, Donald Rumsfeld, these are conservatives that had other belief systems about spreading capitalism, spreading American power. They were less concerned about going into debt. We know that when President Bush, George W. Bush, assumed office after Clinton left office, assumed a budget surplus, and for any number of reasons, the government, the war primarily, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, caused the U.S. government to go into debt. And so those neoconservative belief systems of spreading American power and liberal economic beliefs, meaning classical liberal economic beliefs throughout the globe and so forth, those were more important than, say, maintaining fiscal conservatism. So neoconservatives have any number of conservative values that they hold, but largely it's the belief of spreading in a new way globally American power and the American form of economic power and so forth throughout the globe. And for example, George W. Bush was a social conservative, but he was not a fiscal conservative. So neoconservatives are kind of a unique subsection of conservatism, and they certainly still exist, even though President Bush and his advisors are no longer in power. But since things have changed with new leadership, they're less obviously prevalent in government. Okay, so those are the three primary aspects of conservatism I want you to be aware of. And the reason is that just like I don't think anybody should be purely labeled by one term in any other area of the spectrum, if you're a conservative, we have to find out what type of conservative are you. And so just to give you one more bit of contrast, President George W. Bush's father was not a neoconservative. He was a conservative who believed in American power, certainly, using it overseas. He was not a social conservative, was not connected to the religious right. So even though he was interested in U.S. power and oversaw the war in Iraq, the first war, Desert Storm, different approaches and different philosophies motivating that. Okay. So now let's get back to some other areas here and move out further from the center. Okay, so we have liberals over here, U.S. liberals that, again, they are believers in market economics, but they do not believe that capitalism left to its own devices is a good thing, because they think unregulated capitalism creates too many losers. And in fact, capitalism by its nature creates losers through the system of competition, winners and losers in some capacity. And liberals believe that because profit is such a strong motivating factor and element of the capitalist system, that value will trump all other values, social values and political values. Profit will always come first. And they're very, very concerned about, liberals are, private power exploiting or not necessarily able to handle or speak to many of the other competing values in society. So, for example, liberals believe in private ownership. They also believe the government should control ownership in certain areas. Liberals are interested in fighting for civil rights and fighting for example, protecting the environment and doing something about making improvements on climate change and so forth. In order to do that, you're probably going to have to, you are going to have to pass laws to regulate private businesses and private behavior. And liberals believe that unless you do that, nothing will change, because capitalism, through its need to compete with companies to compete with one another, and the flow of capital overseas and cheap labor markets overseas, that nothing will change unless the government forces private owners of capital to do something. And that is largely proven to be true. Let's just take, for example, minimum wage as an example of this. Minimum wage is a federal law and also state law that requires companies to pay people at least a certain amount of money per hour for their labor. And a look at U.S. history, world history, will tell you very quickly that if you don't force companies to do this, because of the inherent rules of the capitalist system, they'll pay you less. And so liberals, if this is a very simplistic, rudimentary example, but yet it's very historically provable and accurate, that if you somehow or another don't have the government intervene in capitalism and force companies to take on different behavior, they won't, because the rules of capitalism are set up to where there's so much competition, there's so much protection of profit motive and so forth, that they won't do it on their own. There might be some outliers, some companies and private owners that do that, but as a system, major corporations don't do that. And so liberals, we could just look at that as one example, believe in private ownership, but they fear private ownership without government regulation in a way that conservatives do not. Conservatives are worried about government and government power. And there's much to worry about, because if we look at world history, we know that governments are the entity that controls your life. They're the entity that sets laws up. They can declare war. They can essentially recruit people through a draft, conscription, and so forth. They can put you to death through the prison system. They have the legal entity to take away your rights in the extreme and in the moderate. They're the ruling entity of our societies. And citizens need to be vigilant about government because it's a balancing act. You do need government. If you don't have government, you don't have any balancing of the various rights that the framers of the Constitution believed that you were born with and that are inherent in your existence, because you need protection of those rights. Not everyone can protect their own natural rights that you're born with without the government also helping in the protection of those freedoms. Yet, if you give the government too much power, it's very possible that that power will morph into oppression and some type of suppression of your rights in society as a whole. So there is something to be worrying about with government for sure. But liberals point out that there's something to worry about with the private sector, and that is that they are free to use their power of private ownership in a way that can also oppress and suppress free speech, thought, and other types of freedoms, especially if they have an accumulated amount of wealth and power, which they do in major corporations. So liberals believe, again, in capitalism, but a regulated capitalism. And as we get farther out to the left, we have social democracy, socialism, and communism. Social democracy is, sometimes people talk about it as one and the same as socialism, okay? And it's in the same universe, but it's not exactly the same thing. Let's talk about socialism first, and we'll come back to social democracy. Socialism is essentially a political and economic system where overall the bulk, if not all, of the property in a society should be owned by and controlled by the government. And the government in representation of the people of a society, hence socialism. So the means of production and ownership of property is largely controlled nationally by public entities, meaning the government and so forth. Now, socialism can be mixed, a mixed economy, just like social democracy is. All economies are mixed, meaning essentially to some degree there's government ownership and control, and to some degree there's private ownership and control. Socialism as a whole controls ownership of property through the government. Okay, now, and that's because from this aspect on, I have obviously this area ending here. From this aspect on, over here in the spectrum, the worry of people who are social democrats, socialists, or communists is equality. Equality is what is emphasized more in these political ideologies, whereas over here in the conservative element here, moving over this direction, what is more important is liberty, freedom, okay? And we'll get back to that because that gets a little complicated over here by fascism. So as we move over here, it's not that there is no sense of liberty or freedom, but there is more emphasis on equality. And as we get to communism, we'll kind of flesh that out and why communists believe, true blue communists believe, that liberty itself can only come through some sense of equality. But socialism is this system where private property is largely owned by the government. Social democracy, so if we look at Germany and some other countries in Europe where we have, and of course Sweden and the Scandinavian countries, which are considered social democracies, they still have a lot of private ownership. There are private corporations involved throughout the globe that hail from social democratic countries. And so it's not that all ownership is controlled by the government. It's that the government and the political attitude of the citizens is that the government should have a large role socially in constructing the rights and the protections and the standard of living in a society. So again, while there's a lot of government involvement, control, and regulation, there is still private ownership and still individual rights. But in a social democracy, it's the belief that there should be some redistribution of resources to create equality and strike that balance between liberal individual freedom and making sure that there isn't a wide gap of disparity, or should we say a disparity in wealth and so forth. So social democracy, you'll see in social democracies, you'll see obviously a higher tax rate because the government is more involved in providing education and healthcare and so forth. Yet there's still the opportunity to have private ownership of property and so forth. So it's really that kind of balance between liberty and equality. Socialism is moving toward communism in the sense that the government owns the means of production, and that there is a more pure sense of equality, and really not. This is where capitalism ends in socialism. There's not private ownership. There's not a free market competitive system in terms of determining prices and so forth. There's a pure redistribution of resources to promote equality in society. At this point, this is where I want to stop. We've talked about socialism. I want to continue the political ideology discussion in a third and final component of this video lecture series. So we'll stop here, and in the third component, we're going to pick up with communism. We're going to go back over, and we're going to talk about reactionary belief systems and fascism, and conclude with that those aspects.